Hello guys, welcome to my channel. It's Daniel from TechMind Factory. I'm super excited because this is my new series called Modern Identity powered by Azure. In this series, you can expect to learn more about identity services in the Azure cloud and how to leverage them to secure your cloud application solutions. I would like to clarify that in this series we are going to talk about Microsoft Identity Platform, but from the integration perspective. I would like to show you how to integrate your applications with Microsoft Identity Platform, but also how to build modern identity platforms leveraging Azure AD and Azure AD B2C or CIAM. So I think that this will be interesting because nowadays it's not only about the corporate world, but also about the B2C world, so customer-facing solutions. So in this series, you can expect the topics like explanation of identity services in the Azure cloud, how to authenticate users in different kinds of applications like mobile, web, or desktop, how to integrate with Microsoft Identity Platform. So we are going to talk about some best practices and recommendations, how to handle authentication in multi-tenant versus single-tenant applications, how to leverage Microsoft Entra Verified ID service, so verifiable credentials, how to authenticate users with magic links, for instance, how to monitor identity platform with Microsoft Sentinel, and many different other topics that will be helpful for you to build more secure cloud application solutions. So I hope you will enjoy the whole series, and right now I encourage you to watch this first video from the series. Thank you. In this first video, we are going to talk about modern authentication in the cloud apps with Azure Identity Services. So, it's good to understand what Microsoft Identity Platform is. So, Microsoft Identity Platform helps securing applications that are used by users and customers. It authorizes access to APIs or Microsoft APIs, like Microsoft Graph API, for instance. It allows developers to build applications that support users' authentication and get tokens to call Microsoft APIs, such as Microsoft Graph API I mentioned before, or APIs that developers have built, like ASP.NET Core Web API. And basically, when talking about modern identity platform, there are two main services, Azure Active Directory and Azure Active Directory B2C, or CIAM. So basically, Azure AD is more about the corporate world, and Azure AD B2C or CIAM is more about the customer-facing solutions and authentication. And we will talk more about those services in this video. So, Microsoft Identity Platform enables access to applications for organizations' users. So this is this corporate world I mentioned, but also for partners. Yeah. So in this case, if we run organization and we have Azure Active Directory, we can invite partners to our organization or our Azure AD tenant and share resources with those partners. So for instance, we can provide access to different kinds of applications that we own as an organization. And also, Microsoft Identity Platform enables access to applications for customers. So, as you remember at the beginning, I mentioned that it's not only about the corporate world, but also it's about the customer-facing solutions. So this is why Microsoft Identity Platform covers all those different scenarios and personas. So Azure Active Directory is used for managing organizations, users, and partners. Azure Active Directory B2C or CIAM is used for managing customers' accounts. And Azure AD B2C can be federated with Azure AD. So in this case, we can secure solution which can be accessed by corporate users, by partners, and also end customers. And believe me that there are such scenarios, and we will discuss them. So, Microsoft Identity Platform has some key components. So first of all, OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect standard compliant authentication service. So in this case, it's very important to understand that Microsoft Identity Platform is built using the standards, like industry standards like OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. Also, when it comes to integration with Microsoft Identity Platform, Microsoft provides Microsoft Authentication Library and Microsoft Identity Web. So those two libraries can be used to integrate different kinds of applications like APIs, web applications, desktop applications, mobile applications with Microsoft Identity Platform. Also, when it comes to Microsoft Identity Platform, there is a dedicated management portal where we can register applications, where we can ensure that specific application will have access to other resources, and so on. Microsoft Identity Platform provides Configuration API and PowerShell, which we can use for DevOps automation. So as you remember, for instance, we can create applications or register applications in the Azure AD automatically with PowerShell scripts. And also, when it comes to Microsoft Identity Platform, there is great documentation together with many different kinds of samples on GitHub. Microsoft Identity Platform supports many scenarios and authentication flows. So in this case, you can try to imagine the scenario where you have single-page application, you would like to authenticate users there and then call Web API securely. Or for instance, you have browserless app which will call the API. Or you have the desktop application which will call the API. Or you have mobile application which will call API. Or you have multiple APIs that would like to communicate securely. So in this case, you can leverage Microsoft Identity Platform to secure the communication between those different components and also to implement user authentication in the different kinds of applications. Now, the question is, what is the difference between Azure AD, Azure AD B2B, Azure AD External Identities, and Azure AD B2C, so the CIAM solution? So there is a lot of confusion around it, I know it, because I was also confused. So what is the difference? Are those services like separate services? What's going on here? So let's clarify the difference between Azure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory B2B, and Azure Active Directory B2C, CIAM, and obviously external identities. So let's start with Azure Active Directory. It is an enterprise identity service that provides single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and conditional access. It is the part of Microsoft Entra. It enables employees access external resources such as Microsoft 365, the Azure portal, and thousands of other software as a service applications. Azure Active Directory is used to access internal resources like applications on the corporate intranet network, along with any cloud applications developed for our own organization. Now, what about Azure AD External Identities? Azure Active Directory or Azure AD External Identities is a set of capabilities that organizations can use to help secure and manage customers and partners. Azure AD External Identities gives more ways to interact and share resources or applications with users outside of our organization. And just to clarify, Azure Active Directory External Identities is not separate service or Azure AD tenant. It is just a set of capabilities inside Azure AD. Now, when it comes to Azure Active Directory B2B, Azure Active Directory B2B is a collaboration feature of Azure Active Directory External Identities. It's not a separate service, again, it's a part of Azure Active Directory Identity Service. It enables inviting guest users to collaborate with our organization. With Azure Active Directory B2B, the partner uses their own identity management solution and own identities and credentials. There is no need to manage external accounts or passwords. So in this case, let's stop for a minute. You can try to imagine that your organization owns Azure Active Directory. You have multiple corporate applications there, and you would like to invite external partners to, let's say, have access to different kinds of applications and resources. So in this case, you can invite them to your organization, and once they will receive invitation to their mailboxes, they can use either their standard email, like the one they are using, and you can use one-time passcode to access your application. Or if those partners are from other Azure Active Directory tenants, they can use their own home tenant to authenticate, and then you can still provide access for them to your corporate resources. We will talk about the B2B feature and external identities in the separate video, but I just want you to know that Azure Active Directory B2B is not a separate service. It's just a feature in the Azure AD which you can use, leverage, to invite guest users to your Azure AD tenant. Now, when it comes to external users authentication, this is what I mentioned and I want to clarify. External users authenticate with their email and one-time passcode once they are invited to Azure AD tenant. So if those users use their standard mailboxes in many different kinds of services, you can enable them access with one-time passcode. So once they receive the invitation, they accept it, and they want to access one of the, let's say, corporate resources or applications, they have to provide their email. The one-time passcode will be sent to this email. They have to provide this code, and then they are successfully authenticated. And in the Azure AD, the user type for such account is set to guest. So you can differentiate and see that, okay, this is the guest user invited to my Azure AD tenant. However, if the guest user becomes from other Azure AD tenant, they can sign in with their home Azure AD account. So then under user type, we will see still the guest type, but under identities, we will see information that the guest user becomes from external Azure AD. Now, one of the features of Azure AD external identities is called user flows. So let's talk about Azure Active Directory self-service sign-up with user flows. A self-service sign-up user flow defines the series of steps the user will follow during sign-up, the identity providers allowed to be used, and the user attributes we want to collect. We can associate user flows with applications built by our organization. User flows cannot be used with Microsoft apps like SharePoint or Teams. We can associate one or more applications with a single user flow. So in this case, if we want to customize the sign-up flow for guest users, we can use Azure AD external identities user flows. In this case, we can decide that, okay, the guest users can sign up using their standard accounts or maybe social accounts like Google or Facebook. And also maybe during the sign up for such guest user, we would like to collect additional information or attributes of the user like city, job title, and so on. So with user flows, it's possible. And in one of the videos in this series, we are going to talk about Azure AD external identities and user flows. So, there is also another feature in the Azure Active Directory called B2B Direct Connect. So B2B Direct Connect inbound access settings determine whether users from external Azure AD organizations can access our resources without being added to our tenant as guests. And that's the main difference. Currently, B2B Direct Connect capabilities work with Microsoft Teams shared channels. When B2B Direct Connect is established between two organizations or two Azure AD tenants, users in one organization can create a shared channel in Microsoft Teams and invite an external B2B Direct Connect user to it. So it's like a mutual trust between two organizations that use Azure Active Directory. So in this case, right now at least, at the moment of recording this video, we can share channels in the Microsoft team in the Microsoft Teams where Azure Active Directory B2B Direct Connect is configured. Now, let's talk about Azure Active Directory B2C, so business to customer, or CIAM solution from Microsoft. It's a customer identity access management solution capable of supporting millions of users and billions of authentications per day. So in this case, Azure Active Directory B2C, at the moment at least of recording this video, is a separate service in the Azure cloud. It's a separate Azure AD tenant. So those users that will be registered in the Azure Active Directory B2C will not be the part of Azure Active Directory. So in this case, if we are building customer-facing solutions, like let's say we would like to build web and mobile applications that will be used by our customers, then we should decide to use Azure Active Directory B2C. Why? Because, for instance, it's not only about the separation of accounts, like B2C is about the customer-facing solutions and Azure AD is more about the corporate users, but also Azure AD B2C provides many different features that can be helpful when building customer-facing solutions. Like, for instance, with Azure AD B2C, we can enable users to sign in with social accounts like Facebook, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. We can enable integration with third-party APIs. So let's say that during sign up, we would like to create an account in some other system, or we would like to, during sign in, call some API to get additional data related to user, and then inject this data in the token that is returned to the application. So all those different things are possible with Azure AD B2C, but this is not the end. With Azure AD B2C, we can also customize the look and feel of sign-up flows, sign-in flows, profile ID flows, and also with B2C we can secure different kinds of applications like APIs, web applications, and mobile applications. So Azure AD B2C is really helpful when we're building customer-facing solutions. And again, it's very important to mention and underline that Azure Active Directory B2C, at least at the moment of recording this video, is separate service and Azure AD tenant. Now let's talk a little bit about Microsoft Entra Verified ID. So Microsoft implementation for verifiable credentials. In this case, we are talking about decentralized identity. So users can be issued verifiable credential, which will land in the Microsoft Authenticator app or wallet, and then users can use this credential or those credentials to prove their identity when accessing different kinds of resources. But the case is that the identity is managed by the users. It's not managed centrally, like in case of Azure AD. There is more decentralized approach where users decide which data should be shared and when to present the identity. In this series, we will talk about verifiable credentials and Microsoft Entra Verified ID, but I just wanted to mention about it in this video that yes, this is another identity service available under Microsoft Entra umbrella. There are some different use cases where verifiable credentials can be used, like for instance, verified employees' credentials. So we can issue verifiable credentials to organizations' employees so they can identify themselves when accessing corporate resources. On the other side, we can also use verifiable credentials in the B2C scenarios, I would call it like this. So in this case, we can include a certificate about the physician that issued the prescription during the purchase. And also, it can be helpful to use verifiable credentials in the Know Your Customer scenarios. So organization asks to provide two forms of possible sources to confirm user identity, a so-called Know Your Customer. In this case, we can use verifiable credentials to prove the user identity. As I mentioned, we will talk about verifiable credentials in other dedicated video. Now let's talk about some cost aspects when it comes to Azure Active Directory or identity services in the Azure cloud. So you can start using Azure Active Directory for free. So it's very important to mention that we can leverage Azure AD to secure our corporate applications for free. But obviously, there are some limited features under free license. So you can also decide to use other licenses, higher licenses or tiers, like Office 365 apps, Premium P1 or Premium P2 license. So in this case, there is a cost. So for instance, using Premium P1 license will cost you $6 per one user per 1 month. And when you will use Premium P2 license, you will, in this case, pay $9 per one user per 1 month. On the other side, there is a cost related to Azure Active Directory external identities, including Azure AD B2C or CIAM. So in this case, I just want to clarify that the pricing is exactly the same for using external identities and using Azure Active Directory B2C. So first 50,000 monthly active users, so the users that authenticate in our applications, there is no cost related to that. And even if we use Premium P1 or Premium P2 license, there is no cost behind it. But above the 50,000 monthly active users, yes, there will be the cost related to using those services. Now you can ask, what is monthly active user? So this is the user who at least authenticated once in the 1 month period. So as you can see, it's beneficial because you do not pay for authentication operations amount in this case, but you pay per active user in 1 month. So if user authenticated at least once per month, it's calculated as monthly active user. And obviously there is a separate charge, the flat fee for using SMS or phone-based multi-factor authentication attempt. So when it comes to the cost, let's try to calculate it. I mentioned that 50,000 monthly active users are for free. So in this case, let's try to calculate it from for the Premium P1 license. So if we take the cost for one user, and we will multiply it by 100,000 users totals, and then we will decrease it using those 50,000 monthly active users for free, the cost will be like $162.50 in this case. Yeah. So as I mentioned, it's very beneficial again because we can start using the service for free. And we can implement user authentication in our cloud applications. Okay, great. So now let's talk about modern identity platform architecture. As you remember at the beginning, I mentioned that it's not only about the corporate world. Right now, the customer-facing solutions are also related to corporate solutions. And I would say that there is a mix of different approaches which touch the corporate world and customer-facing solutions. So this is why it's not only about Azure AD, but it's also about Azure AD B2C or CIAM. It's also about the external identities. So in this case, I would like to show you different components in the solution architecture which you can leverage to build modern identity platform. But before that, let's talk about different functionalities that are required. So I would like to present some requirements that are presented by customers when building different kinds of identity solutions. So for instance, there should be support for all 3 personas I mentioned before. So identity platform should provide options to authenticate by organizations' employees, partners, and customers. And customers' accounts should be created in the separate directory, so in the separate tenant. There should be a programmatic way to create user accounts. So there should be a possibility to create user accounts using APIs, for instance. This is for automatic user account creation and for migration purposes. So maybe there are some existing accounts in the external identity systems, and we would like to migrate those user accounts. Custom branding support, for instance. So login and registration pages for customers facing applications should use branding aligned with organization's brand. So in this case, if we talk about the corporate world, obviously we would like to have those login pages customized accordingly to our company's brand. But also if we are building customer-facing applications, again, we would like to align it with the product brand. Yeah. Another requirement, magic links support. Customers should have option to sign in using magic links without using passwords. Or different social identity providers should be supported. So customers should have option to sign in using standard accounts, but also to use their social accounts like Facebook or Google. Identity protection should be enabled. So there should be identity protection for all types of accounts enabled to detect potential risk. But again, this is not the only and the last requirement. There should be support for verifiable credentials, for instance. So verifiable credentials should be used as one of the options for user authentication. We should secure different kinds of applications. So identity platform should provide secure access to different kinds of applications like mobile, web, desktop, and so on. And also, we would like to implement some DevOps automation. So identity platform should be managed using DevOps automation practices. Yeah. So as you can see, those are only some of the requirements around functionalities that you will face when you will start building modern identity platforms. So now let's talk about the architecture in the context of building modern identity platform. So in this case, as you can see right now on the screen, this is the solution architecture of modern identity platform powered by Azure. Obviously, you will find Azure Active Directory there, so the core service to secure access to corporate resources. But also there is Azure Active Directory B2C or CIAM. Yeah? So this another identity service which you can use to secure customer-facing solutions and applications. But this is not the end, because we want to also leverage verifiable credentials, as I mentioned before. So again, this is a separate service and we need it in the solution. We need to include it in the architecture to make sure that users can use verifiable credentials to prove their identity. And also, when it comes to verifiable credentials, we would like to also provide live notifications. So you can try to imagine that when you scan the QR code, when you want to issue verifiable credential, there are different kinds of events like, okay, QR code is scanned, verifiable credential is successfully issued, or a verifiable credential was not successfully presented, and so on. So we would like to react to those different kinds of events, and this is why we can leverage serverless services in the Azure cloud like Azure Functions and Azure Signaler service to send live notifications to different kinds of applications. Also, when it comes to different requests related to verifiable credentials API, we would like to cache some information. So in this case, obviously, when building such scalable solution, we need some distributed cache. So in this case, we can leverage Azure Cache for Redis in the Azure cloud to cache some information. Now, when it comes to APIs, there are many different options to implement and host those APIs in the Azure cloud. One of the options is to utilize a serverless offering called Azure Container Apps. So in this case, we can leverage containers. We can host our APIs in the Azure Container Apps, and then those APIs will provide different functionalities like magic links functionality, user identity management using Microsoft Graph API, or verifiable credentials API to communicate with Microsoft Entra Verified ID service. Obviously, the direct access to those APIs should be forbidden and should be secure and should be consistent. So this is why we should leverage Azure API Management Service in this case to securely to secure access and to securely access those APIs, and also to have like a consistent layer of accessing those APIs. And as I mentioned before, we would like to also customize the look and feel of login and registration pages. Yeah. So in this case, we have to leverage HTML and CSS files, and we have to somehow host them somewhere. So in this case, we can leverage a storage account in the Azure cloud. And also we can use Twilio SendGrid service to send customized emails, like for instance with OTP codes. Now moving forward, obviously we can federate Azure Active Directory or CIAM solution with external identity providers like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or many other identity providers. And in this way, we will enable our users to decide which identity solution they want to use to authenticate and access our secure resources. And also, when it comes to security, it's good to leverage Azure Front Door with Web Application Firewall to secure access to both APIs and also access to Azure Active Directory B2C or CIAM. And also, when it comes to Azure Front Door, if we want to use the custom domain with Azure Active Directory B2C. So we don't want to display b2clogin.com, but we want to, for instance, display the domain of our company, like login.techmindfactory identity. In this case, we have to use Azure Front Door. Obviously, when it comes to monitoring application insights, to monitor what's happening inside those APIs and inside the code, but also we can leverage Microsoft Sentinel to detect threats related to identity, and Defender for Cloud to react to different threats related to cloud components and services like Azure Containers apps, functions, and other services. Great. So I also mentioned that DevOps practices and automation is important here. So this is why we can leverage Azure DevOps and Azure pipelines to automate deployment of those different components. And obviously you don't have to use Azure DevOps, you can use GitHub, for instance, for this. But the case is that still it's good to have some DevOps automation to not create all those components manually from scratch. And probably you saw my previous other video about modern identity platform on the Azure cloud, and this is the diagram from this video. And again, as you can see, many different components are exactly the same like on the previous diagram. The case is that, as I mentioned, you can decide how you want to host those different kinds of APIs. So on the previous diagram, you saw that I utilize Azure Container Apps, but you can also use Azure Functions to host those different kinds of APIs like Magic Links, User Identity Management, or Live Notifications. So it's your choice, but still some set of functionalities will stay the same. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if you will use Azure Functions or Azure Container Apps to manage users in Azure AD B2C, because still you will have to write some code and still you will have to leverage Microsoft Graph SDK. Great. So this is it when it comes to this first video. I hope you enjoyed the content, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you.